Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weeb Union, and in this one we start out in the Krasnohorivka section of the front line, where the Russians have managed to capture the final parts of the southwestern parts of the city, securing the southern flank. With this, the Russians are now in full control over the main part of Krasnohorivka, with only the suburbs remaining in the northern and western parts of the city. In the Pokrovsk section of the front line, there are several advances by the Russians in separate directions. First off, in the Nirodivka direction, the Russians have restarted offensive operations, assaulting and storming the eastern parts of the dacha area of Nirodivka. The Russian objective here is to reach the central parts of the town, at the same time as the Russians are also pushing in the northern direction, south of Petishe, in the direction of Kalinove and Nirodivka from the north. The Russians have captured yet another fortified position of the Ukrainians along the Vovcha river line and the outskirts of Petishe in the southern direction. The Russian objective is to reach the northern parts of Nirodivka from the north and the eastern parts from the east, where they are planning to capture each part separately, the eastern parts by the Russian forces in the Telove and the northern parts through Kalinove and down south towards Nirodivka. The Russians have already cut off the main highway here to the northeast of Selidove. This means that the Ukrainian supplies going towards Nirodivka is limited to a by-road here in the western parts. This means that the main supply road has been cut off, and the village of Kalinove, for example, is very isolated from the rest of the Ukrainian positions. With the current situation, the Russians are looking to gain control over Kalinove and push the Ukrainians out, and the fortified positions along the Vovcha river line and Nirodivka reservoir, gain access to the crossing and gain control over the fortified positions right next to it, and then flank Nirodivka from the rear. The objective would also be to continue pushing along the fortified positions along the river line here by the Vovcha river line from the reservoir area and along the fortified positions east of Selidove. So we see several pushes by the Russians in the direction of the Vovcha river line and the Nirodivka reservoir, as well as the town of Nirodivka. In the direction of Nirodivka, there has been massive changes as the Russians have managed to reach the central parts of the town, leaving the majority of it in a gray zone, as we see heavy fighting taking place and Ukrainians are operating armored vehicles and tanks within the town. The Russians have made and gained a foothold in the apartment complex area, which has allowed them to progress quickly to the central parts of the town. So we see heavy fighting in Nirodivka, and this could lead to a quick collapse of the town, as the Russians are not just storming it from the east and south, but they're also expanding it from a northern direction from Krychyi Yar, and they're also now fighting towards Krasny Yar from the Shuravka direction and Nirodivka from the Shuravka direction. The objective of the Russians here is to attack the entirety of the third line of defense at the same time as they're storming through Nirodivka to gain access to the high ground. The Russians are exerting massive pressure on the Ukrainian positions within Nirodivka to the point where a few armored vehicles were forced to withdraw. They're trying to withdraw from the road between Nirodivka and Mirnorad. However, due to the heavy pressure and the constant reconnaissance of Russian FPV drones, they were hit on their way out. The Ukrainians moving from Nirodivka towards Mirnorad have to go through this main road, directly connecting the two, and from this road it is very obvious that presence and movement is there because it's just an open road. There's nowhere to hide in this open field between Nirodivka and Mirnorad. This means that the Russians are constantly bombarding this road, which is the third line of defense of the Ukrainians in the Pokrovsk direction. Based on this, we see that the Ukrainians are having a very difficult time defending Nirodivka, and the third line of defense here in the Pokrovsk direction is in such a difficult state due to the heavy bombardment of the Russians that we may see a Russian attempt to break through it, through Nirodivka, capturing it, and then breaking through from the railways towards Mirnorad and Pokrovsk itself. At the same time, we see statements such as this one from Deep State Map, talking about the 151st Brigade, Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. According to the statement of Deep State Map, I quote, "And during this extremely difficult situation, very strange processes take place. in particular in the 151st Brigade, whose command neglects personnel, sending drone pilots who are unique specialists in the trenches to hold positions. The effectiveness of such orders is zero, because fighters either become 200 or are forced to leave their positions under the enormous onslaught of the enemy, who as a result has another advance. The corresponding transfers take place despite direct order of the Commander-in-Chief, prohibiting the use of pilots in other activities. The unit commander's attempt to prevent this resulted in his removal and transfer to another position. We hope that the High Command will pay attention to this situation and let the commander of the 151st Brigade understand the price of pilots and the zero effectiveness of such orders, which as a result turn into another success for the Russians. The 151st Brigade is one of the few brigades that are defending in this direction. There is the 31st Mechanized Brigade, there is the 68th Jaeger Brigade. Previously there was the 47th Mechanized Brigade. However, a Abrams tank has been visually confirmed to be destroyed in the Kursk direction, and the only one operating Abrams tanks is the 47th Mechanized Brigade, combined with the fact that this article by Defense Security Asia claims that 20 out of 31 supplied Abrams tanks to Ukraine has been destroyed by Russian troops. This means that there's only a single Abrams unit left from the deployment of troops into the Ukrainian direction in Pokrovsk. There are additional brigades like the 25th Airborne Brigade and the 110th Mechanized Brigade, but they are located on the flanks. The ones with direct involvement is the Jaeger Brigade, the 31st Mechanized Brigade, and the 151st Mechanized Brigade here in the Pokrovsk front. The 47th Mechanized Brigade is now in the Kursk region. Therefore, based on all of this, we can determine that the situation for the Ukrainians in the Pokrovsk section is very critical. They are outnumbered and outgunned. Despite that, the Ukrainian command still makes stupid decisions, which Deep State Map is furious about. Therefore, we can conclude that the Russian advances are not stopping anytime soon. It may even speed up. In the Toretsk section of the front line, the Russians have entered the southern parts of the city, so we see that the Russians have not just gained a foothold in the eastern parts, but also in the southern parts. Both of these areas are filled with apartment complexes right at the outskirts, and then we go further into the town, the city. We see a lot of regular residential buildings and houses. This means that the initial stage is more difficult than the upcoming stage. And considering the Russians having complete control over the second line of defense of the Ukrainians in the Toretsk direction, we are likely going to see additional advances here as well. And similarly to the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians are not going to stop anytime soon, but instead they're just getting started with their offensive operations both in the direction of Toretsk, Pokrovsk, and Nirodivka in the direction of Kurhove. Further north here in the Mifka direction, the Russians have captured the remaining parts of the eastern bank of the Serbs River line of Nirodivka. So we see that there is this southern parts outside of the main parts of the town, and then there is a part beyond the Serbs River line. Based on this, the Russians have a fraction of the town under their control, but mostly pretty much everything under the eastern bank is under their control, at the same time as the Ukrainians recaptured parts on the western bank. So we see that the real question is whether or not the Russians are able to take advantage of this to cross over, or if they'll be remaining on the eastern bank, and that will determine what sort of operation the Russians will launch based on their recent advance. In the Kursk direction of the front line, there's hardly any changes. In the southern parts, the Russians have re-entered Spelnoe and are fighting to counterattack and regain control over the town. The town is connected to Borki, which is then followed up with a flank in the northern direction with the river line and in the western direction with the forest area. This means that there is no easy or direct connection between Borki and Plechovo, after which there is additional river lines separating the Ukrainian positions from each other. Therefore, we see that the Russians are here looking to regain control over the river line here in the southern parts to prevent the Ukrainians from taking advantage of the current situation and pushing further. This will also allow the Russians to relocate their troops to defend the northern bank of the river line, which is in the direction of Sucha, where the Ukrainians are expanding their offensive operations. Further north, in the direction of Koronevo, there has been some significant changes to the front line here, and that is that the Russians were actually present in some of these eastern towns, and they managed to regain control over Kalinov and cut off the Ukrainian presence in that direction. Instead, the Ukrainians pressured from the western direction from Olgovka up across the river line and in the northern direction. So we see that the Ukrainians actually had their presence mainly in the western parts rather than the eastern parts. And now that the Russians have regained control of some of the villages in the eastern parts, they may look to regain full control over the Ukrainian incursion across in between the two village chains, and then regain control over the area, which will then lead to the Russians pushing here in the direction of Turovka, where they'll regain control over the river line. So the Russians are here attempting to break any of the Ukrainian presence beyond their front line and re-establish the front line here to the north of Koronevo, which could stop the Ukrainian flanking maneuvers to the rear of Koronevo. This shows that the Russians have been able to defend Koronevo well since the start of the Ukrainian invasion of Russia, which started now 18 days ago. At the same time, in the direction of the same river line, which spans from the western parts of the border to the eastern parts of the border, I did some digging into what it actually means with the current situation where all three bridges are destroyed and the pontoon bridges are constantly being built and constantly getting hit. According to the reports, it seems that first of all, the Russian troops in the southern bank of the river will not have their equipment magically disappear once the bridges are blown. They'll still have all of the available equipment and ammunition as it was. At the same time, the river line itself is very shallow. It may be about 60 to 70 meters wide in some areas, but it is very shallow to the point at which worst case scenario for the Russians that the Ukrainians completely cut off all supplies, constantly hit the pontoon bridges, and the Russians are unable to re-establish any sort of supply, and they get slowly grinded down until they have nothing left. They can swim across. And the amphibious capabilities of some of the Russian BMPs would also be able to drive across some parts of the river line, maybe here in the western parts rather than by the bridge area. So we see that there is a potential for the Russians, in case of full encirclement and complete cutoff of supplies, to not get cut off, to not get encircled, and to retreat across the river line. So they would eventually have to give up their positions if they are unable to break the siege here south of the river line, but it is unlikely that they will do a mass surrender or fight until the last man, as they would be able to withdraw across the river line. The river line is not like the Dnieper River, and even across the Dnieper River, the Russians were able to withdraw across despite the constant Ukrainian bombardment. And this is if they decide to withdraw, they may decide to launch counterattacks instead. We do not know so far. But the Russian positions here in the north of Koronevo has significantly improved with the recapture of some of these towns, which means that the Russians may be looking to launch a counterattack in the near future to regain some of these positions in the direction of Koronevo, securing the Russian forces south of the same river, and starting a general push towards pushing the Ukrainians out of the Kursk region. At the same time, we have this report by the Russian ambassador to the United States. He claimed yesterday that Putin has taken a decision on his response to the Ukrainian Kursk invasion, and he is convinced that the ones responsible will be punished severely, according to his words. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.